What you are looking at is a ghost, or at least the closest thing to it. On August 6, 1945, the Little Boy nuclear bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, creating a fireball with a surface temperature of about 6,000 degrees Celsius. For context, this blast was about 500 degrees Celsius hotter than the surface of the sun. Upon detonation, the atomic bomb nearly instantly ended the lives of some 140,000 people. Of that 140,000 people, roughly 85% of them were civilians. Scattered around the spot where the bomb exploded, these dark imprints were left on the ground where there were people. While the surroundings were bleached by the explosion's heat and radiation, people in the blast zone shielded the earth beneath them with their bodies, leaving behind shadows in their image. This was, and still is to this day, the single largest loss of human life from an act of war in history. To quote Peter Kuznick, the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at American University, "It was not just a war crime, it was a crime against humanity." The commonly held wisdom when it comes to the ethical dilemma that was the bombing of Japan is that it was a necessary evil in order to end the war and, in turn, save more lives than were lost. This, however, could not be further from the truth. In reality, it was never the bomb that made Japan surrender. It was the Soviets joining the fight. Which means the 140,000 people that died in Hiroshima and the 70,000 that died in Nagasaki 3 days later lost their lives for no reason, leaving behind nothing but their ghosts. Following the bombing of Japan, the nuke rapidly injected itself into the greater cultural zeitgeist, soon making it the most culturally significant weapon in all of human history. There have, of course, been other major advancements in the realm of allowing humans to inflict suffering upon one another, from the blunt rocks we used in the Stone Age to bash each other's heads in, to the creation of the firearm capable of relieving a man of his mortal coil in the blink of an eye. All, however, pale in comparison to the raw destructive might of the atomic bomb. A stone can kill a man, a gun, several, the bomb, a city, a collection of bombs, the entire world. International conflict from the inception of nuclear weaponry changed. We entered an arms race the likes of which the world has never seen. Doomsday devices were no longer confined to the realm of science fiction novels, they became real. For the first time, the idea that a military entity could wipe all human life off the face of the planet became a reality. In the words of Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer upon witnessing the first ever detonation of the nuclear bomb, "Now I am become death, destroyer of worlds." These words struck fear into the global populace. A fear so primal, so intense, so directed at the heart of humanity's very existence, that they defined the following 4.5 decades. Unsurprisingly, a weapon of such unprecedented power swiftly took hold in popular media. In 1954, Japanese film director Ishiro Honda came out with a film that symbolized everything post-war Japan feared about the atomic bomb: Godzilla. In an interview, Honda put these fears into words, stating, "If Godzilla had been a dinosaur or some other animal, he would have been killed by just one cannonball. But if he were equal to an atomic bomb, we wouldn't know what to do. So I took the characteristics of an atomic bomb and applied them to Godzilla." The monster perfectly represented the destruction Japan had faced during the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the continued effects of nuclear fallout that plagued the country. The film opens with the titular Godzilla destroying a Japanese ship in the Pacific Ocean, a reference to a very real event that happened some months prior to release. In March of 1954, Americans were testing a nuclear bomb in Bikini Atoll, some 3,800 kilometers off the coast of Japan. The aftermath of such testing naturally resulted in a sizable amount of radiation dispersing throughout the surrounding area, and making contact with an unfortunate Japanese fishing boat. It wasn't long before the crew fell ill, and one particularly unlucky man lost his life. The events in the opening scene of the film when it was released 8 months later mirror those of this tragedy, although clearly with a more destructive extravagance inherent to monster movies as a genre. In the original film, Godzilla was a manifestation of pure cataclysmic power that was awakened by use of nuclear weapons, specifically the bombing of Hiroshima. It was a being of unforetold devastation brought forth by the hubris of mankind. Interestingly, and in a rather ironic twist of events, the American localized version of the film told a different story entirely. For Japanese audiences, being the direct victims of the atomic bomb, Godzilla was a horror film and the monster was something to be feared. For American audiences, it was presented as a comedy. In the original Japanese cut of the film, much of the story is presented with a necessary air of gravitas in order to keep audiences focused on the political messages it wanted to portray. It wasn't necessarily a depressing film by any means, but more of an affirmation to the thoughts held by the Japanese public at large, having very recently experienced the horrors of nuclear warfare. The thesis of the film more or less states that we as a species are meddling with power beyond our control, and we should stop before it's too late. At the end of the Japanese cut of the film, Godzilla is defeated, but it is clear that if use of nuclear weapons continues, it may rise again even more powerful than before. In the American cut, however, many of the politically charged scenes are removed entirely. The connection between Godzilla's emergence and the bombing of Japan, a theme central to the Japanese cut's narrative, is left entirely on the cutting room floor for the American version. Strangely, a significant amount of entirely new footage starring Canadian-American actor Raymond Burr was added into the film. This odd, whitewashed version of the original movie removed virtually all suggestion of American culpability for the events of the story, in both the fictional and non-fictional destruction inflicted upon Japan. Fittingly, the final lines of the film were changed as well. Where the Japanese original ended on a warning that this could happen again, the American edit removed this and instead ended on a note that suggests that everything is fine and back to normal. Subsequent reboots of Godzilla have continually strayed further and further away from the message of the 1954 Japanese original. The 1998 film, although keeping reference to the atomic origins of the monster, only suggests it arose from some sort of nuclear tests, not the actual bombing of Japan. The 2014 reboot ditches the thematic importance of the bomb entirely, placing Godzilla as a vague allegory for global warming. By the time the 2019 reboot rolled around, virtually any attempt to have even a modicum of political commentary was abandoned in favor of just having a big lizard destroy some stuff. Not all American media, however, was so dismissive of the power of the atomic bomb. While it was in the government's interest to keep people more or less apathetic to the existence and proliferation of such weaponry, there was only so much they could do without moving directly into the territory of censorship. Still, in much of American culture, nuclear power held a connotation of being generally good, a symbol of American ingenuity. It wasn't really until the Cuban Missile Crisis that this sentiment began to shift for many Americans. In 1962, several Soviet nuclear weapons facilities were constructed in Cuba, a mere 140 kilometers from continental United States. Initially, the United States government had planned to conduct airstrikes and a ground invasion of Cuba. However, President John F. Kennedy opted for a more passive approach, constructing a naval quarantine of the island nation in an attempt to keep the Soviets from continuing to supply nuclear weapons to their bases during negotiations. In October of 1962, a Soviet submarine armed with a 15-kiloton nuclear torpedo, a bomb with the same payload as the one dropped on Hiroshima, attempted to pass the naval quarantine and underwent harassment from U.S. naval forces. Dummy depth charges were dropped on the sub, but the crew aboard thought they were real. Running out of air and patience, the Soviet officers aboard ordered the nuclear torpedo to be armed and made ready to fire. Fortunately, however, Captain Vasily Arkhipov was able to convince the other officers on board that they ought not escalate the situation and should instead surface and contact Moscow. Had he been unsuccessful in this effort and had that torpedo been fired, it is likely that it would have been the straw that broke the camel's back and turned the Cold War into an all-out nuclear conflict. In November of that year, the United States and the Soviet Union were able to reach an agreement and de-escalate the situation, resulting in the removal of Soviet nukes from Cuba and the removal of American nukes from Turkey. There generally exists some sort of consensus that this is the closest the world has come to all-out nuclear warfare, excluding, of course, the actual nuclear warfare that took place in Japan nearly 20 years prior. But I digress. Concerns about nuclear war were at an all-time high for the duration of the crisis, until they rather abruptly halted. In the following year or two, US diplomacy efforts with the Soviets stepped up a bit, and after the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, the public seemed to have completely forgotten about the bomb. Nuclear tech began a rebranding campaign, becoming less focused on bombs and being more focused on energy production. Additionally, rising conflict with Vietnam at the time distracted many Americans in terms of military attention. Despite apparently waning interest from the public, an uptick in staunchly anti-nuclear media began to crop up, one of the most prolific of which being Stanley Kubrick's 1964 masterpiece, Dr. Strangelove, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love the Bomb. A masterclass in dark humor and political commentary, and backed by semi-realistic theoretical research, the events of the film struck at the heart of what remained of American concerns about rising conflict with the USSR. Placed at the beginning of the film is a disclaimer that the United States Air Force claims that the events of the story are entirely unrealistic, and that safeguards against such things occurring are in place. Something we would later find out, thanks to declassified documents, was a complete lie. To give a short plot synopsis for those of you who have not seen it, and of course, spoiler alert here, the primary conflict within the narrative centers around the actions of an insane military base general who, due to short-sighted decision-making on behalf of the US government, was able to unilaterally order 15 US bombers to conduct nuclear strikes on Soviet territory with a recall code that only he knew and no alternative override code. He also orders the entire base to go into lockdown and shoot anything within 200 feet of the perimeter on site, even vehicles that appear to be American, because he believes them to be, in reality, a communist threat. Eventually, news of these events make their way to the Pentagon, and a congregation of military leaders is called. Things look bleak, so the Soviet ambassador is called into the war room as a show of good faith, and an attempt to contact the Russian president takes place. We then learn that the Russians have a doomsday device of sorts in place that is set to automatically detonate if a nuke is dropped on Soviet territory, and will make the world entirely uninhabitable to all human and animal life. Following this, a series of events occurs, culminating in a situation where it looks like things are going to work out. From the codes to call the planes back being discovered, to said planes actually being recalled, to the one plane that had its communication systems damaged earlier being unable to open the bomb bay doors to actually drop the nuke on its target. However, all this comes crashing to a halt when, high on the possibility of promotions and glory, the commanding officer on the damaged plane manages to manually open the bay doors and drop the bomb, dooming the entire world to nuclear annihilation. Dr. Strangelove is a story with a lot of moving parts, but today I want to focus on two major criticisms of the American government during the time of the Cold War. The first being McCarthyism, and the second being the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, alongside, of course, the proverbial nuclear dick measuring contest between the US and the USSR. McCarthyism, or the Red Scare, although it was slowly diminishing by the mid-60s, was still prevalent in American politics. The basic idea behind it was that as tensions with the Soviets rose, there would be communist spies in the United States. It was a modern-day witch hunt, turning neighbor against neighbor on a scale that did not match the actual threat in the slightest. In the context of Dr. Strangelove, however, we have American military forces firing upon other American military forces under the guise of a communist takeover that, in reality, has not happened, and is nothing but the fabrication of the deranged warmonger U.S. Brigadier General Jack D. Ripper, a name that is a not-so-subtle nod to the infamous serial killer from the UK. Additionally, we have outright hostility directed toward the Russian ambassador by one of the American generals when he is invited to the war room, as he is suspected to be spying on the US military's plans while there, something that has to be quelled by the now famous line by the US president, "No fighting in the war room." Naturally, as this film is still a comedy, it eventually turns out that despite his apparent cordiality during the duration of his visit, despite the thus far neutral depiction of the Soviets in the film, and despite the impending nuclear destruction of the entire world, the ambassador is actually taking the time to spy on American military operations and take pictures of the board. And, of course, despite nodding to the untrustworthiness of the Russians alongside the Americans in the film, the studio that eventually published Dr. Strangelove held concerns that it was anti-American and pro-Soviet propaganda, to the point that the film nearly never got released. The film's commentary on the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, or MAD doctrine, is something that it wears on its sleeve. In short, for any of you who may be unaware, the basic concept behind mutual assured destruction as a peacekeeping mechanism is that if rival nations each have a nuclear stockpile sufficient to entirely destroy each other, and systems are in place to ensure a full-force retaliation if one nation attacks another, no war will take place out of fear of annihilation on both sides. There are, naturally, some issues with this idea that Dr. Strangelove brings up. Firstly is that MAD doctrine assumes perfectly rational actors in all scenarios. A real-world example of where this almost became an issue that led to wrongful nuclear war was the aforementioned Soviet submarine during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where one of the officers on board came to believe that war had broken out when in reality it had not. In the case of Dr. Strangelove, we have General Ripper, a clearly irrational nutjob who was bloodthirsty for conflict and actually did manage to bring about the end of the world. Another problem with MAD doctrine is that it assumes that the nations capable of engaging in nuclear warfare actually care about the survival of either their own citizens or the citizens of uninvolved states. In the film, this objection takes the form of the doomsday device. If such a device were to exist, even as a deterrent to nuclear warfare, if it ever were to detonate, it would not only wipe out the Americans, but also the entire rest of mankind, including the Soviets. At this point, it becomes difficult to determine what exactly such a device is meant to deter, as in the case of wrongful detonation as happened in the events of the film, it ended up destroying those who it was meant to protect. There exist, of course, other objections to Mad Doctrine, but these are the two that are primarily levied by Dr. Strangelove. Although the film at release was widely regarded to be of exceedingly high quality, many critics took aim at the political messaging behind the film and insisted upon their agreement or lack thereof with Kubrick's views rather than his art. It seems opinion was largely split along ideological lines. Conservative film critics at the time described Dr. Strangelove with a vitriol indicative that they had bought into pro-nuclear government propaganda. One reviewer called the film a farce constructed for the benefit of liberals and pacifists. Another called it an evil thing about an evil thing. Yet another referred to Dr. Strangelove as the most shattering sick joke I have ever come across. I could go on, but I think I've made it rather clear that a significant portion of the American right wing was very unhappy such a film existed. Okay, actually I lied, we're going to read one more, this time from an academic rather than film critics. The then director of the Foreign Policy Research Institute at the University of Pennsylvania said it accomplished the communist goal of driving a wedge between the American people and their military leaders. He went on to ask, will it raise military men's morale to be told that the men who lead them are imbeciles or neurotics? The implication of this question, of course, being that we ought not be overtly critical of our military leadership for the good of our troops. Considering the fact that this film released the same year American involvement in Vietnam really stepped up, the third most unpopular war in US history only behind Afghanistan and Iraq, this question and its implications would go on to be rather comedically ironic. The United States government was none too happy about the existence of the film either. In response to its release, a propaganda short film was created called SAC Command Post. Essentially, SAC Command Post was a short walkthrough of some of the ways Strategic Air Command operations functioned, with a heavy emphasis on how safe launch systems purportedly were. It has been a long-running myth among the American populace that the only person with the capability to order nuclear strikes, either offensively or retaliatory, is the President of the United States. This, however, is not the case. It can't be, and it doesn't even make sense that it would be. Although the nuclear football has gained a certain level of notoriety, in reality it appears to be little more than a symbol of power, even in the probability that it actually does contain launch procedures. While it is uncertain whether or not this is still the case today, as they were back then, the US military is adamant that everything is secure and safe. During the Cold War, a significant number of military officers had launch capability. Under the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, there existed a do-or-die attitude toward nuclear warfare, and we definitely leaned hard into the do part of that choice. We were not so much concerned with safety measures to prevent accidental launches, but rather the capability to swiftly respond to potential Soviet aggression. According to an interview with a former ICBM launch officer and denied by the US Air Force, during the height of the Cold War, the launch codes were static and set to 8 consecutive zeros in a row. Even in the case where someone attempted to brute force a nuclear launch, this would likely be the first number that they tried. Despite the fact that there still exists enough atomic bombs to send us into a global nuclear winter, and Mad Doctrine still being in effect, along with extant tensions between the US and Russia and rising tensions between the US and China, the general public's attitude toward the bomb is one of overwhelming apathy. In many respects, nuclear weapons have become defanged in much of modern media to such an extent that they are viewed with the same level of triviality as a simple firearm. There exists perhaps no better embodiment of this shift than the Fallout franchise and its evolution over the years. In 1997, the first Fallout game was released, developed by Black Isle Studios. It was, in many respects, a jab at mankind's arrogance, mocking the idea that proliferation of nuclear power can lead to anything other than a wasteland. While the game's politics may not necessarily be explicitly anti-nuclear, it makes it clear that the bomb is a power to be used only in the most dire of circumstances, and only as a last resort. Where in both Fallout 1 and 2, the only nukes in the game are only able to be used to kill the final bosses. That isn't to say, however, that the games take use of nuclear power entirely seriously. In fact, both of the original 2 Fallout games from Black Isle Studios create a satirical view on the nuclear era, populating the map with advertisements and propaganda from a world where people learn to stop worrying and love the bomb. Contrasted, of course, against the irradiated hellscape that such an attitude produced. Once the franchise was acquired by Bethesda, however, a certain shift in the way nuclear power was portrayed became evident. The new developer, it seems, missed the joke to some degree, and that became increasingly clear as the series went on. By the time Fallout 4 came out, the political messaging of the original games, and even 3 in New Vegas on some level, on the dangers of nuclear power had all but evaporated. The player was given access to nuclear weapons, and they are treated essentially the same as normal ones. There is no moral weight to using them, which presents an unintentional irony to this being the case in a post-apocalyptic world that was devastated by that same force. The franchise has become, in many respects, a reflection of what the original story was satirizing. This reached critical mass in Fallout 76, where no longer are the nuclear arms that the players have access to merely pocket-sized bombs, but instead full-sized nukes. No longer are they a last resort option tied to important decisions, but are instead something that players are incentivized to use whenever they gain the opportunity. Instead of being a raw force of destruction, they ironically transform the area they are used on into a proverbial piñata of loot and resources. No longer is the question, should I detonate this bomb, but rather, why shouldn't I? Likewise, no longer is Fallout a cautionary reminder of the power of the bomb, but rather an endorsement. War never changes, but we do. Largely, we've stopped caring about the existential threat of nuclear weapons. To give you some idea of how widespread this nuclear apathy has become, in 2020 a study was done where 16,000 people around the world between the ages of 20 and 35 were polled to gauge millennial outlook on global crises. Of those polled, the majority stated they believe we will see a nuclear attack within the next decade. However, in spite of this, of the 12 issues listed, nuclear weapons were deemed the least important by these same people. In fact, almost twice as many people considered terrorism to be a more important issue than nuclear weaponry. The main source of this ambivalence comes from a certain acceptance veiled within layers of irony that we are slowly headed toward a dystopian era and there's nothing we can do about it. Essentially, nuclear stockpiles are a problem that is beyond our reach, so who cares? If irony has become our coping mechanism toward the existential threat of the oncoming apocalypse, then all that's left to do is stop worrying and love the bomb.